Hello, everyone, and welcome to Best Practice Strategies Before, During, and After. And this presentation is a little bit different than my normal national presentation because it is October 2020. So before, during, and after refers to COVID. We have had a lot of changes in our world and in animal welfare, thankfully. And this presentation in particular is geared towards smaller nonprofit shelters. My name is Dr. Sarah Pisano. I'm a veterinarian and founder of Team Shelter USA. I am with the University of Florida and also the Million Cat Challenge. I want to thank everyone from the Mount Pleasant Animal Shelter in New Jersey, the board of directors certainly for inviting me to do an assessment, the staff at the shelter, all the amazing volunteers, and everyone who answered the survey. I have reviewed the surveys and I hope to answer all your questions tonight during this presentation. If at the end of this presentation you still have questions, there is a place for you to do so, and I will do my best to answer all the questions. This presentation, as you know, is on YouTube, so it'll be recorded if somebody wants to go back and reference or watch it. And the actual PowerPoint presentation will be posted on the shelter website and Facebook page if you wanted it for reference. But I want to start with why you're all here this evening for this presentation, and it is because we all love animals. This happens to be my dog and cat, and this is their bed in my kitchen. We want to remember that this is why we're here. So everything that we think and do and how we work together benefits animals, but this is what we have in common and why it's so important that we all work together. It's also important to define what success is for every shelter or organization. And for me, that means I want to be able to help the most animals possible. But we're going to talk about what that looks like. And it doesn't necessarily look like we have to take them into the shelter building, but there's lots of ways that we can help animals, and we can help more animals and people. So we have to think about what our definition of success is. I've done way over 100 community and shelter assessments since 2013. Some shelters much bigger, some smaller, certainly in more rural areas, more urban areas, much higher poverty rates. And I'm here to tell you that regardless of the location in the country where I am, what shelter I'm working with, it doesn't matter if it's Dallas, Texas, or McCreary County, Kentucky, population 15,000 people. The challenges that we face in animal welfare are all the same. They're universal. And thankfully, the solutions are universal too. There are recommendations that I'm going to present this evening. They are based on the Association of Shelter Veterinarians guidelines for standards of care, and those you can find online at sheltervet.org. And I actually published the best practice playbook for animal shelters based on the guidelines and all of my work making these recommendations for best practices throughout the country. And all of these strategies have proven, and I didn't make any of these up, these are all what we sort of all agree on at the national level as the core best practices. The playbook is on Amazon. If you have not heard about fear-free, fear-free is a philosophy that means we want to pay attention to how we are behaving as staff and volunteers in a shelter. And well, actually, it started in private practice, but now you can get fear-free shelter certified. It's online, it's self-paced, and it's at no cost. So we recommend that for everybody from board of directors to volunteers and staff. The Million Cat Challenge I should have mentioned as well. If you're not familiar with the Million Cat Challenge, the website is of the same name.org. So please visit us and learn about all these different great initiatives that we recommend, but certainly the assessment and These recommendations apply to cats and dogs, and I will point out when there might be specific recommendations for one or the other. But people often tell me how upsetting it is in shelters and how devastating the problem is. And it is true. It is sad that 5.4 million animals entered shelters in 2019. But you know what? 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you're talking 20 million or more. We didn't really even know all the numbers. Now, if Best Friends, a national organization, actually counted, and we now know that in 2019, we are down to 533,000 animals euthanized in shelters. And that's, again, from millions and millions. So we are making progress, even though it might not seem we are. We're making amazing strides. We also have good news with COVID. Out of the devastation of this pandemic came this amazing renaissance and realization that communities really did want to step up. Shelters were emptied over and over. When they asked their communities for help, people came in droves to foster and adopt. Adopt a Pet is a search engine for adoptable animals, and they usually see about 5 million hits a month. And during COVID, the first month, they went up to 12 million views. And those views are more intentional. People are spending more time on pages. The number 3 breed is pit bulls. Sometimes people say, oh, our shelter is full of pit bulls and nobody wants pit bulls. I beg to differ. They're America's dogs. Those people love those bully breeds. There's other great news from Greater Good. This is an online search engine. They put a call out for foster parents, and 82,000 people nationwide stepped up and said, we want to foster. Half of those that registered had no children in the house and no kids. They call them unicorns. And those are attractive families or people for shelters because we don't have to worry about pet-on-pet interaction or anything like that. And half of those said they would take medium and large dogs. So there are lots of people in our communities that want to foster. Another interesting thing about Greater Good is the demographics showed it was people under 34 years of age. So good to know if you're looking for fosters, make sure you reach that demographic. Amazing news from Maddie's Fund is as these animals went into foster care during the first part of COVID emergency when there was a lot of shutdowns, Maddie's Fund reported that 75 to 80% of those foster babies or adults were adopted by their fosters, or those fosters found their foster pets permanent homes. What about money? People said, oh, we can't raise money during COVID. Well, we also proved that to be wrong. And we see lots of money being raised even in short periods of time. At the Million Cat Challenge, we raised over $250,000 in a few weeks just to buy shelters portals to provide adequate space for cats in shelters that needed it. You can see these other numbers that are just gargantuan, and nobody thought that we would be able to raise money like that. But it just means that we should not make assumptions and decide for people. You do the ask. You ask people for help. And even if they can't give as much as they normally would, maybe you'll have more people give a little bit and make up for that. But what we're going to talk about tonight is, let me try to get this. What we're going to talk about tonight, I hope that bottom bar is not barking or blocking you, but I'll tell you what it says. We're going to talk about the traditional animal welfare system is animals go into the shelter and there's not really many barriers to enter. Maybe there's no surrender fees, maybe there's no questions, but we bring those animals into the shelter and then there's many self-imposed barriers to get them out. So we're going to talk about that because This is a plan, the traditional old school system is a plan that's destined for failure and challenges and makes all our jobs harder and makes it harder for animals and people. Because what we need to concentrate on, if we take an animal into any shelter, public or private, is length of stay. We want to get animals out of the shelter as soon as possible. When you do the fear-free training, again, it's fearfreeshelters.com. We learn all about FAS, which is fear, anxiety, and stress, and frustration. And that's what happens when animals are in a shelter, just because it's not a natural environment. It's not a home, right? And people are coming in every day that are strangers, new people. So it's really hard for animals. That makes it hard for people. We can get overcrowded. That can lead to inappropriate handling. When animals are stressed, especially cats, they get upper respiratory infections. Now we have decreased life-saving potential. People might not want to adopt those animals if they have medical problems. And then we're kind of reacting all the time and wasting precious resources, which includes our shelter space. So I want you to think about capacity for care as a formula. So there's lots of variables in this capacity for care, and it's much more than the number of cages or runs that I have available. So it's the number of animals coming in. LOS means length of stay, and then the number of animals out. This is the formula we always have to make sure is balanced. So our length of stay, our capacity is all tied in to our resources that are way beyond our shelter space. The Human Animal Support Services is now a joining of all the animal welfare leaders in the country. You can check us out at humananimalsupportservices.org, but it really is about capitalizing on and engaging our communities and focusing animal welfare as opposed to a shelter-centric system to a community-centric system. We think about foster care for children. Many, many years ago, we had orphanages. Well, that proved ineffective and not healthy and not the best in the best interest of children. And now children are in individual homes. So this is the same kind of idea. Let's have a community-centric model and reserve the shelter space for animals that don't have any other options. But the key to doing this, because I'm asking you to think differently, is to respect that we all have our own microcosm. This is a blend of how we were brought up, what our parents taught us about animals, what our education was, what type of community you lived in. Did we live in the city or rural? I know I grew up in the country and my dog never saw a leash in her life, right? So I'm like, leash law, what the heck is that? You know, our community, our beliefs. And you see, that's the biggest circle because that really creates our opinions and philosophies. We have to respect our own microcosm, but just as important, we have to respect everyone else's microcosm. So if somebody is worried about one of these best practice strategies, then we have to say, well, let's talk about it. What is it that makes you nervous? And it usually comes up, well, this happened to me in the past, so I'm nervous about that. We need to have these conversations while respecting each other's microcosm. The other thing we need to remember and give ourselves a break about is that our human brains automatically trigger to the negative. We automatically amplify the negative and we come up with the worst case scenario. So for example, if we had 100 amazing experiences today, but one incredibly horrible experience, that is the experience we're going to remember, we're going to talk about, and we're going to lose sleep about. We have to step outside of that bubble and say, wait a minute, is this the norm? Is this the truth? Is this the average? What's really happening? Am I making this bigger than it is? And this is something we have to work on every single day. That's because when we talk about animal welfare and these best practice strategies, our fears of a negative consequence are a barrier to life saving. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. One of the first assessments I did was Waco, Texas. Now, this is an open admission public shelter, but I wanted to tell you this story because the bars are intake. The green on the graph on the bars is live outcome, and the blue is euthanasia. So I got there at the end of the second bar, that was the fiscal year 11-12, and said, hey, I think you should try these best practice strategies and we'll help you step by step. Well, look what happened over time. We used the shelter space for animals that needed it, but it immediately ended euthanasia or decreased euthanasia dramatically. Remember, euthanasia is the blue. And then ultimately, ended euthanasia for space and only for animals that were in dire straits. In Mount Pleasant, there's not that risk of euthanasia, but when we reserve shelter space for animals that don't have any other options and help other animals in a different way, we can help more animals. So I hope that graph shows the potential for that, because there's lots of things that are in our control. There's some things that are not. A pandemic's a perfect example. Natural disasters, things like that. Those things are not in our control. But look at the list that is in our control. Who we take in the shelter and why, when we take them in the shelter, what our policies are, what is our flow through of animals, meaning population management, what are our live outcome rules and regulations and policies, how are we getting animals out, are we collaborating with as many partners as we can, what are our beliefs and philosophies, are we really trusting the community, or are we afraid of the community, and are we afraid to trust? So systems change is really hard when you're looking at changing the foundation of an organization. It's hard, but we have to think, wait a minute, I don't want to work any harder. This is already hard enough. I want to work smarter, reserving the shelter space. That means I can provide a fear-free environment in the shelter to the best of my ability, knowing it's not the same as my home, in the shortest length of stay, and reserving any animals that need to be euthanized. I call that true euthanasia. And the true euthanasia we define as large, dangerous dogs that we cannot safely rehabilitate. We've tried, we've done everything we could in respect to their aggressive behavior and medical cases beyond any reasonable hope. So in open admission shelters, the benchmark is over 90%, but again, arbitrary, because we want to make sure that we are really using that true definition of animals that really are beyond hope, that we can't help. And it means that we are going to use all of our resources strategically. When I say resources, people usually trigger to money, but there's a whole heck of a lot we need to think about, and we need to think about what we have, not what we don't have. Shelter space is certainly a resource, but it doesn't mean, again, because we have an empty space, that it should be filled. Maybe we don't have the staff and volunteers to care for those animals appropriately. Maybe that pet needs emergency care or something like that. But focusing on what we do have is an amazing way for the team to figure out how to help more animals. And volunteers are such an important part of that. Who on our volunteer team, or how can we get people who have experience with behavior, especially with those dogs that need behavior training? What do we have, and how can we capitalize on those partnerships? Building this foundation is absolutely crucial, because what I find in every assessment is that we are drowning in these symptoms, that if we, and they're downstream, so if we just fix the foundation and we just fixed what was going on upstream, we can turn the tide and all of those symptomatic issues go away. And upper respiratory is one that comes to mind that we're going to talk about. I know Mount Pleasant is a private organization, but I always like to talk a little bit about public policy because that matters to every single shelter, whether it's public or private. It matters because there's things like stray holds, and they may be at your state law or your local level. So it's important to know what those laws are, and especially those barriers to life saving, because that will help us create the best possible intake and population management decisions. We want to make sure there's no barriers to life saving. I'm very sad about the 7-day stray hold in New Jersey at the state level. There are only 7 states in the country that have a 7-day stray hold. And the reason that's an issue is because we know the data shows that most people reclaim their dogs within 72 hours. So it doesn't increase the chance of reclaim. And then for cats, it's a whole different story. So we'll get to that because these are the national return to owner rates. For dogs, it's only 22%. For cats, it's even worse. That's not a typo. Less than 2% of the stray cats, and I'm using quotation marks because I don't believe there's such a thing as a stray cat. I don't think cats get lost. It's very, very rare that a cat get lost, but they do not get reunited from a shelter. So there's a better plan. Knowing nationally that only 2%, less than 2% of the animals coming into the shelter are reunited, the cats, we have to say to ourselves, all right, well, that's terrible. And certainly we'll try to increase that, but maybe there's a better way than having this 98% failure rate. So that's an example. And I hope anybody listening starts working on that stray hold piece at the state level. There is such power in those public and private partnerships, and animals deserve these partnerships to be very powerful ways for us to help as many animals as possible. Volunteer programs, number one. Mount Pleasant has so many great volunteers that care deeply. Volunteers need standard operating procedures and job descriptions and training. No different than staff, same thing. Easy onboarding process, mutual respect, and true partnership. I snuck in some pictures. Most of these pictures are of my fosters. This is my previous foster dog, Potato. I am not a foster failure. I'm a successful adoption. So she is now Potato Pisano. So I adopted Potato during COVID. But targeted spay-neuter is one thing that is a great way for all animal welfare organizations to work together and see how there could be collaboration to create a program, especially for low-income people, to subsidize spay-neuter. And that's because most of the animals entering our shelters are from that population of people. So when we subsidize, heavily subsidize spay-neuter for those people and provide access, our shelter intake decreases. And this is a graph of all the shelters both shelters in Jacksonville, and the green is actually the number of targeted spay-neuters, and the other two is intake and euthanasia. TNR we're gonna talk about separately, but a great way to target if there's any grants or things or collaborations happening besides the fixed income pet owners is high intake areas, especially in those open admission shelters in the communities, and certainly those large breed dogs that typically have really big litters. So you can see the same trends in Waco, Texas. In Huntsville, Alabama, we had great success, but the line is not as sharp, and that's just because that was a network of private practice veterinarians because they didn't have high volume spay-neuter clinics there. But the same impact. When we target, we can help take less animals will enter our shelters. And then we have to think, who is entering the shelter and why? And that's just called managed admission, and it's good business, and good business practices help more animals. So remember the graph or the cone that I showed you before. This cone was upside down because it was just a free-for-all of animals flooding into our shelter. With a managed admission system, what we're saying is, wait a minute, who can we help without taking them into the shelter? So that safety net. The question should be, how can we help you keep or place your pet without bringing them into the shelter? Do we have volunteer partners? Do we have foster care volunteers on deck? Are we doing TNR? Do they need medical help? Is there some sort of way we could collaborate with other organizations to come up with some great programs to help people who love their pets keep their pets? And keeping pets in homes has never been more important than it is now, as our economy is likely to get worse, as more people are going to face financial hardship. It has never been more important to help preserve pets with their families, so that the ones that we take into the shelter, especially a limited admission private shelter that has limited space, we should be taking in animals that we can get out really quickly to their permanent adoptive home, or certainly to a foster home where they will get adopted from, and removing barriers to live outcome. That means I can help way more people and pets than just taking them into the shelter, and it decreases the number of animals coming into the shelter who had other options. So again, I can help more pets that did not have other options. I've seen shelters, in fact, with similar intakes as Mount Pleasant, go from 1,000 animals a year to helping 2,000 animals a year. And those even came into the shelter just because the length of stay was managed. And the ASPCA, a couple of years ago, did this awesome study that was very humbling for me, I can tell you, that found that 80% of pet owners did not want to surrender, but they did not have access to resources that they needed. So again, we should be asking people, what do you need? How can we help you? And how can we help you get access to care? There's lots of great emerging models. Open Door is, we are about to embark on a national training program, but this is to blend private practice veterinarians with access to care and have a financially viable business. One Health means we're working with social workers and Meals on Wheels and different social services to make sure that pets are not falling through the cracks. So again, there's a lot of great things happening and emerging, and I hope that places in New Jersey learn about these things as well. When the Brevard Sheriff's Office in Florida started this managed intake program and just asked the question of people, what can we do to help you keep your pet or place your pet? They helped 80% of those animals without ever bringing them into the shelter. That was the first year, the second year, the third year, and the fourth year. So it didn't stop working. And they did that all that first year. That was all budget neutral. They didn't even add anything to their budget. The other thing that's very important is capitalizing on the goodwill of Good Samaritans. And those Good Samaritans are bringing animals to a shelter because they care. But we've never asked them, hey, could you be a foster parent? You care about these pets, and we have limited resources. We have limited number of volunteers, certainly for those bottle babies. So could you possibly, and we'll talk more about those bottle babies and not kidnapping the kittens, but could you possibly foster these babies, and we'll help you with the vaccines and the spay neuter and all of that? That's always going to be cheaper than bringing them in the shelter. But look at what happened in the city of Jacksonville at their shelter. They were sending about 450 animals to foster a year. And the first year they asked those Good Samaritans, look how many more foster parents or foster babies they sent to foster care. Amazing. 3,774. Now, remember, they have a very mature live outcome program, so that doesn't mean they got stuck in foster care. They went into foster care, they got adopted quickly, and then we continue to get those good Samaritans to help us. Home to Home is something that I recommend for every shelter and community. It is a new website, and it was developed by a small nonprofit shelter in Idaho who had a waiting list for animals to be left in the shelter. And the director said, I think, why don't we try to help that list so that they don't have to wait weeks and weeks? Like, clearly they don't have an emergency because they're holding on to their animals. So Home to Home is now, it was funded by Maddie's to help other organizations. So this can be woven into your Facebook page and your shelter website or your rescue website page and your rescue Facebook page. And it's so great if everybody in the community uses Home to Home, and everybody says, hey, if you need to find a home for your pet, this is the first place you need to stop. We're going to post them on Home to Home. And then after, if that doesn't work after a month, then let's talk. Let's see what else we can do. But if all else fails, then we'll bring them into the shelter. So we know that about 80% of the cats that are entering shelters are community cats, and that means friendly or feral. So there's no distinction. We also know that from 2018 and 2019, because that's when Best Friends collected all this data, twice as many shelter cats are euthanized versus shelter dogs in the United States. So they're much higher risk for coming in the shelter. So the point is, it's more crucial even for cats that we reserve this precious sacred shelter space so that we can make sure we're getting as many cats and dogs saved. So overcapacity is a problem. When we don't have the right housing, they get very stressed, and that leads to upper respiratory infections. But there is a solution, and it's a combination of trap, neuter, return and shelter, neuter, return. In New Jersey, because of the stray hold of 7 days, we recommend that the community cats should not go into a shelter. They should go directly to a spay-neuter program and go back where they're already cared for. I can promise you, when this program started in 2008, I thought it was crazy and I did not agree with it. But now I realize that I'm looking at cats that are 10 or 12 pounds. They're healthy. They're looking at me like, I am certainly not starving. I have several homes, and I'm friendly because I have several homes and I sleep on different beds every night of the week. So cats, we know that about half of cat owners let their cats in and out. Personally, I'm not one of those people. I choose to keep my cats inside, but I don't judge other people for letting their cats out. So I'm not sure why we have trained the public to take outdoor cats to a shelter in the name of reunification, when we now know that nobody goes to the shelter to reunite their cats. You could say, oh, well, we're going to get them a better home. Well, let me take you back to half of the people in America let their cats out. So you are potentially adopting to another person that will let the cats out. And you have to be okay with that, because this is a natural way that we live in our society with cats. So you don't want to deny an adoption. You certainly want to educate the people about the safety issues and all of those things, having a collar, the microchip, and all of that, but educating them, but not denying them. And again, it doesn't make sense because you're just going to be recycling cats. So you take them to an adopter who says they're never going to let him out, but the cat drives him crazy because he's used to going outside. Somebody sees him outside, thinks he's lost, goes into the shelter. So he's just on this vicious cycle, and it doesn't make any sense. So the super highway for cats that are outside, we want to make sure they're being TNR'd, so that trap, neuter, return, same thing as shelter, neuter, return, except here in New Jersey, we don't want them to enter shelters and be subject to any stray hold. It is unfruitful and it is unfair to the cats, and they should be returned to their original location where they were already cared for. There are some situations where we can't return them for whatever reason, but they are few and far between. That's where our working cat program comes in. Or maybe it is a friendly cat. We can't put it back to its original location. That's a cat that could perhaps go into our adoption program. But what about the feral? The feral, no, should go to a barn or working cat program and never be subjected to staying in a shelter. We have so much data about this, and we know that it's the right thing to do. And all the data shows that about 1% of those cats were too sick, ill, or injured to be put back. So, or some cats have some simple problems. They get that issue addressed and they get put back where they are already cared for. They did not need us. We need to help cats. There's so many cats that need us. We need to reserve our precious finite resources for those cats. I snuck in here another one of my foster kittens to remind me to talk about not kidnapping the kittens and making sure we're educating the community. People panic when there's nursing moms outside and the mom goes to get something to eat. And the kittens cry and people panic. They grab the kittens and they bring them to the shelter. And now you have newborns or bottle babies that now you have to panic to find somebody to take care of. And that is not easy, and it was not necessary. The mom was just looking for some food and coming back. kittenlady.org has such great information. If you're not familiar with kittenlady.org, please visit her website and Instagram. She's amazing. She has she has lots of handouts, but one in particular is how do I know if these kittens are in distress? And great pictures and visuals. So please visit kittenlady.org. Now for kittens, if they are socialized already and they come into the shelter, as long as the shelter is, number one, not overcrowded, and number two, has a short length of stay, there's no bottlenecks, there's no wait times, they get assessed and they get adopted as quickly as possible, then okay, we take them into the adoption program. Ideally, we want to get them straight into foster, and then to adoptions that way. And a very small off-ramp in the superhighway would be for feral kittens, because those kittens may take up a foster home for many weeks or months and they will never be socialized, very unlikely to be socialized. And so it's in their best interest and the interest of our resources and the number of kittens and cats that we have to help to put them back where they were already cared for. Again, there might be minor exceptions where that can't happen, and then we have Plan B. But this sort of system where we do the TNR, if we are in a state where there's no stray hold for cats, again, we recommend no stray hold for cats anywhere at the state level or at the local level, because this is the program that gets all the cats home. It's the fiscally responsible thing to do. It's in the best interest of cats, and it decreases the number of cats out there, especially those that are negatively interacting with people. There'll be less interaction and negative impact on wildlife. And then you, again, can manage your shelter population much better, not just of cats, but of dogs as well. And for public shelters, if anybody's listening from a public shelter, your enforcement complaints about cats just plummet. So everybody wants to know, like, that's all fine and good, but who pays for this and who does all this? Well, it's all the old-fashioned way, and that's why I talk about collaboration and partnerships. And I don't expect one shelter to be everything to everybody, but we all have to work together at the community level. And this can happen. So this is, again, a public shelter, and you could think about Mount Pleasant or a private shelter. What if I didn't take in community cats? What would my intake look like? And because the highest percentage is those community cats, this is what happens when you do those programs. This happens to be Nashville, Tennessee. Remember, the blue is euthanasia and the green is live outcome. Look at that dramatic decrease in intake and the dramatic increase in live outcomes. So those are the trends that you want to see. For a private shelter, it's okay if the intake is higher, but as long as it's those cats that really needed you. Same thing in Greenville, South Carolina. The first year they did this program, 2,000 less cats went into the shelter, 2,000 less euthanasias. Decreased again the second year when I was back in Greenville. The kitten that you're seeing was the only kitten in the shelter for adoption. There were no other cats or kittens, and that's because they got their system down. When I was there originally, they didn't have portals. They were very crowded. They had tons of upper respiratory infections. This all changed because of doing the community cat programs right. But if you want more information and you want to know the nuts and bolts and the studies and the sources, please go to millioncatchallenge.org and watch our webinar, The Cat Superhighway. It's under webinars and resources, creating a roadmap for hashtag all the cats. We have packed, Dr. Hurley has packed so much studies for those of you who like all that proof and research. It's all in one webinar. So if this is something you want to learn about, please visit millioncatchallenge.org. And a lot of private shelters will say, or even public shelters will say to me, but we have room for more cats. Why wouldn't we take them in the shelter? And I hope that I've already answered that question by saying it's not about having space in the shelter. That cat already had a home where it was cared for, or a caregiver. It is a 10 or 12 pound. It's a visually healthy cat with a full body coat. Otherwise, we'll intervene. But it doesn't mean that you should take them in the shelter just because you have room. That's not in the interest of a cat who didn't need your help. It is a waste of precious resources, and that does mean money and staff and capacity at the shelter. So that leads me to capacity for care and what we have to think about when we take animals in the shelter. And this is the formula that we always have to have in the back of our minds. How many animals do we have in? What is their length of stay? And how many are going out? And I promise you, the box in the middle, the LOS or length of stay, is the most important thing, because you can help a heck of a lot more animals if you have a short length of stay. So think about that dog or cat that you took into the shelter and it's taking up that runner cage for 5 months or 6 months. Think about now all the animals that you could have saved in a week in that cage, and that's the only cage you have. So your decision is, do I want to save X this year, or do I want to save 2 or 3X? Of course, we want to save as many as possible. So that length of stay and thinking about all these different strategies, they're all intertwined, and they all mean when I take a capacity for care means when I take animals into my shelter, I am able to provide a fear-free shelter free of anxiety and stress and frustration. So that means from the point of intake, I will have a plan of action. I will advocate for them. They will be on my website, on my Facebook page. They will be, I will be marketing them and advocating for them the whole time they are in either the shelter or foster care. And certainly the foster parent is going to do the same. That working within capacity for care means I'm allowing the system to work so that I can provide that fear-free housing. But it all begins at intake, and you all are so amazing, I know, at social media and community outreach. Remember what I said, what Greater Good found at the beginning of COVID is the demographic that surprised them is most of the people that came forward were 34 years or younger. So if people do want to adopt and they come to the shelter or they're looking on the website, or the Facebook page. We want to make sure that there's no missed adoption opportunities, that they can see everyone. There are lots of times when animals come into the shelter with medical problems, with behavioral problems, but it doesn't mean they have to stay, and they should not stay in the shelter. So if we're casting this net, we're trusting our community. Hey, we need help. Can anybody foster or adopt this pet with this particular problem? And here's how we're going to help you. And so when we provide that support, especially post-adoption, or if we need to keep them as a foster while we help them over that hurdle, then that's fine too. Something that surprised a lot of us because of COVID is the outrageous success of virtual adoptions. There's a lot of adoptions still happening with FaceTime, with Zoom. People are making appointments on social media, and the staff is introducing animals to them on virtually, and it's working great. So we need to make sure we're capitalizing on all the great technology that's out there. So we want to make sure that, again, part of that capacity for care is ample housing, appropriate housing for the animals and sizes that we're taking in. So for cats, they need, we know, a minimum of 11 square feet per cat in a cage versus, or double cages, versus a free roam room, which each cat needs 18 square feet per cat. So this is a picture of a portal, and this just connects two cages. Could be stainless or a plastic cage, it doesn't matter. But what this does is allows the litter box on one side and the food, water, and bed on the other side. Cats are fastidious. They are clean. They don't want to sleep near their litter box. They don't want to eat near their litter box. They need to have the option to be away from their bathroom, no different than us. We don't want to eat in the bathroom either. And double compartments are really great for dogs too. Actually mandatory. We want to see everybody have a double compartment. For cats, it could be a double compartment or enough space, enough hiding space, places that they can perch or hide and have enough square footage while they're doing that. But what is stressful for cats, and why does it matter? Why do these things matter? We know now, we have research that shows these are the things that are stressful for cats. Just being in the shelter, moving them to different places in the shelter, and that's because they have to get used to smells again and again. My blanket is taken. Now I have a different bed. This is stressful. It's no different than people. I'm confident that tomorrow, I know I'm going to wake up with my stuff in my bed. My car is going to be in the driveway. I'm confident that I know what to expect. When animals enter a shelter, they don't know that. They don't have the confidence to know that that's what they can expect because everything is unfamiliar. And when all those smells are taken away from them, they have to start over and get accustomed to the space. It's stressful when cats don't have enough space when they are housed in a cage, or if it could even be a free roam room, but there's bullies in the free roam room. And so that could be an issue. So we have to be careful about our free roam rooms, but they need options just like people. All of that stress leads to upper respiratory infections, which are caused by viruses, which are often latent in their respiratory tracts. So it's not that cats go into a shelter and catch a URI, it's that the way we're housing them and the length of stay that they're in the shelter and how we're husbandry for them, how we are caring for them. For example, they don't need to be taken out of the cage and fully disinfected. The cage doesn't need to be fully disinfected for the cat that's staying in that cage. It's no different than you staying in a hotel. So they don't come in and change the sheets and change all the towels and disinfect everything until you leave. They just tidy up, straighten up here. Same thing for cats. So we want to try to keep as much familiar stuff with them as possible, as long as it's not soiled. For dogs, they need those double compartments. So glad to see so many of those runs at Mount Pleasant. Every animal, dog or cat, needs a safe place. A soft and safe place to rest. They need human contact. They need interactive toys. And for dogs, not just going on walks, but play groups are where it's at. So there's 2 national groups that do training. One is Dogs Playing for Life, and one is Shelter Playgroup Alliance. These groups travel all over the country, and they train shelter staff and volunteers. Volunteers are a very important part of this, and they train them how to select dogs for a play group, and they might be 5 or 6 dogs out in a play yard together, maybe more, maybe 10, depending on the dog. Now, there's some dogs that won't tolerate play group, and that's okay. But when they need natural play, they need to be dogs, if you will. So play groups are a great way to accomplish that. And at Mount Pleasant, there's so many great spaces outside to do that. What we want to think about, and as we talk about transitioning from a shelter-centric to a community-centric animal welfare model, means that we want to have our foster parents on deck. So when I get a pet in, I can just turn them around, call my foster, boom, they go to the foster home, and that's on track for adoption through that foster home. Now, what if I don't have any fosters on deck? Okay, those animals stay in the shelter. But Pima, Arizona pivoted to this during COVID out of the emergency situation. That shelter handles 19,000 animals a year. Their community came forward in droves, just like so many other communities across the United States and here in New Jersey, that said, we want to help. So they said, wait a minute, this is an amazing way to work. So guess what? This is what they're doing. They have very few animals in the shelter at a time. The animals come in, they stay less than a day, and most of them go to their foster on deck home where they're on track to go to get adopted. So that's really an amazing model in a way that we can care for animals better, and then we become more of a resource center at a shelter as opposed to the place where animals are left. And if animals do come into the shelter, they're in our foster homes, we're looking for people to adopt them, there is no shortage of adoptions. Best Friends did a study a couple of years ago that showed 76% of the people who purchased from breeders or pet stores, people which, by the way, I judged because they didn't go to shelters, had already visited an adoption agency, which meant it was a shelter or a rescue group, and it was typically a private shelter, but it was too difficult, invasive, or cumbersome, and they were denied. So there's we have so much information now and so much research to show that there is a better way to adopt animals and save lives and release those fears. This is with good intentions. Remember our microcosm, but our microcosms of fear and judgment hold us back from life saving. And there are many missed adoption opportunities because of it. If you have not read Adopters Welcome, please go online tonight at animalsheltering.org, which is the Humane Society of the United States website. Put in the search box, Adopters Welcome. You can order this handbook for $15, or you can read it for free online. It is the best open adoption playbook out there. It's amazing. And it helped me back in 2015 release my judgments and my beliefs. And I read it and was very humbled because I thought, oh boy, I was wrong about that. And I was wrong about that. What we know is people 1 in 4 animals is adopted from a shelter or an adoption agency. That means 75% of the animals in the United States, 144 million pets, are from places other than a shelter or rescue group. So we are not the only game in town. We need to trust there's a lot of people out there that are amazing pet owners. We need to engage our communities, and we need to draw people into the shelter and to get interested in adopting and keep this beautiful wave of support that happened since the beginning of COVID. Keep that going. We know that making the right match is the most important thing. And number 2 is how we support our adopters after the adoption. It needs to be an easy, streamlined process, but those 2 things, making the right match and supporting our adopters after the adoption. So I want to thank everyone so much for listening. That is the end of the formal presentation, but I have Lori who is going to be texting me any of your questions. We did have a couple of questions come in earlier, and one was about cats in shelters. If they're kept in cages, do they need to get out and exercise? And the answer is, I know that you had asked if they should be taken to another room to exercise. And I think that goes along with not moving them. I think that is stressful to put them in a different room. It likely has all these other smells, and it depends on the cats. So what the good thing about Mount Pleasant is that you have some cages and you have some free roaming, and that's perfect because some cats would prefer free roaming and some cats would prefer to be in the cage and they'd rather sleep. So it really depends on the cat. The other question was, what should the priorities be for the shelter? And I think the priorities are thinking about that formula and what the intake policies look like so that we can make sure we start partnering with other organizations to see, listen, this is not a great candidate to come into the shelter. We don't think we can adopt them quickly. So let's see how we can set up this safety net. And then population management, how can we get them out quicker? Let's look at all of those steps. So those are the 2 things that I would say. So I am just going to check my text and see if we have any more questions. I will just wait a minute for Lori to type in the text. So this is my newly adopted former foster dog, Potato, and that is a picture of her on, that is her adoption party picture. That is Sweet Potato. Okay, so we have a question. What is the average stray hold? That's a great question. The recommendation for dogs is a 3-day stray hold, but you also want to make sure that if your state law, a lot of state laws are silent on the stray hold, so that's good. So you want to make sure that at the local level, at your ordinance level, it's 3-day stray hold for dogs, and you have the ability to send them to a foster home within that 3 days with a contract saying if you find the owner, they have to bring them back, and no stray hold for cats. Those are the recommendations, but there are a lot of outdated ordinances, so we are working a lot between all the national organizations. We work on a lot of ordinance revisions and help communities update those. But that's a great question. When helping to remove, what is our responsibility to make sure they are going somewhere safe? Oh, rehome, sorry. When helping to rehome, what is our responsibility? How can we make sure they're going somewhere safe? So again, this is about trusting. So I want you all to remember your microcosm. You have Facebook feeds of animals that are in distress, that are being abused, that are being treated cruelly. You have to remember that that's your microcosm, and that's not the norm. That is not the normal population of people reaching out to you, whether you're a rescue group or a shelter. Most people can be trusted. You want to when they come to your agency to adopt, you want to ask them, what are you looking for? Tell me about your family. Do you want an active dog? Do you want a couch potato? Are you looking for a young kitten or an older cat? So you want to ask those questions again and make the right match. The things that traditionally you're looking for now, and I'm talking generally about private shelters and rescue groups, asking questions like, do you rent? Do you have a fence? What happened to all the animals that you've ever had? What is your veterinarian's name? We're going to call the veterinarian. All of those things do not guarantee that you will have a successful adoption. What will matter? None of those things are correlated. What correlates is that you build a relationship with the person you're adopting to, so that when there is an issue, you're going to first, of course, educate them up front. You're going to help them make sure the transition is smooth. You're going to support them after the adoption if they need help, right? The alternative is that you deny them. That is a person that it's in the 75% that's going to go get a pet. And a lot of times they're going to go down the street to their neighbor whose cat just had a kitten, and now they have an unvaccinated, unsterilized pet, where now the cycle will maybe continue. Maybe they didn't have access, but we can't judge people out of a pet that they are going to get a pet. So we want to help them be the best pet owner that they can be. The next question is, could you chat a bit about FIV and leukemia and how shelters can best help them? Ooh, that's a good question that I didn't even touch on, because that's a big whole another thing. Okay, so for community cats, so when we are doing TNR or shelter new to return, and the community cats are going to go back, I'm going to talk about two scenarios. One is the community cats. There's no testing that needs to be done. That's because I'm looking at this cat who is visually healthy, and I'm not worried about leukemia or FIV. It is not that prevalent, but I'm looking at the cat now. The cat is visually healthy, and they can have a normal lifespan. And if I remove that cat thinking I can't put the cat back because it's going to infect other cats, you already have positives in that neighborhood. So the recommendation is spay neuter, because the intact ones are the ones that are transferring the FIV and leukemia. So don't waste your money testing for leukemia and FIV on those community cats. Spend the money on spay neuter. In the beginning of 2020, the Association of Feline Practitioners came out with new recommendations for shelters about testing for leukemia and FIV. And that is something that everybody should read. And what was alarming, and I think was great to have the proof, is that you can test cats over a month. You can test them once a week, and sometimes they're going to be positive and sometimes they're going to be negative. So already it really doesn't make sense to test, because or to test that particular cat, especially if it's going into a home by itself, or there's two cats that are being adopted into a home with no cats. What we do recommend is, because the incidence of positives is far less than 5%, instead of shelters spending all that money for something that's happening less than 5% of the time, tell the adopter, go to your vet and talk about the risks, and your vet will help you decide. Now, if you have cats that are already positive and you're trying to help them, actually, especially with FIV, the recommendation is that they can live with other cats as long as everyone is sterilized and we're not seeing that transmission like we used to think. So I'd encourage you all to read those. It's the Association of Feline Practitioner Guidelines in 2020, and you can just Google that and look at that online. What are your thoughts about, this is the next question, what are your thoughts about a do not adopt list or refusing an adoption? I would say it would have to be a pretty significant, like, something happened in that house that had to do with cruelty, neglect, or hoarding or something like that. But you would have to have proof that that happened, because again, if you deny somebody just because, and I'll give you a perfect example. I'm going to deny somebody the adoption of this dog because they don't have a fence. And this happened to several veterinary friends of mine. In fact, classmates of mine from vet school. 3 of them in different states were denied adoptions because they didn't have fences. And, one of them lives on a ranch and is an equine practitioner. So her dogs are very well behaved and run around the ranch. Another one has a cabin in the woods and she doesn't have a fence. So we can't place a judgment on that. It's a blanket statement. We're not going to adopt out unless they have a fence. I have a friend that has 3 greyhounds. She's never had a fence. She walks her greyhounds all the time. So we want to be very careful. Again, if you deny them, that's going to limit your life-saving potential. But again, they are going to get a pet. So why not take the opportunity to really help that person become a good pet owner? And you can do that and help them. Of course, there's going to be situations, like I mentioned, that are very extreme, but are few and far between when you look at the whole host of people. Okay, the next question is, what are your thoughts around fosters finding adopters from their friends on Facebook or social media? Okay, so I'm going to answer that question. Thank you very much. That's a great question. My answer is a question. Who better to find a home for their fosters than the foster parent? So way back when, we used to say you go to foster care and then you come back in the shelter for adoption. And when I think about, that's the craziest thing that we did that. Why didn't I think of that? That's a double intake. My foster parents are obsessed about their fosters. So I want them to find their foster babies. They're not going to give their foster babies away to somebody that they don't feel comfortable with, and they're already interacting with them and asking them questions. So absolutely, you want them to do that. That's exactly what you want them to do. Okay, the next question is, if animals are in foster, what is the best way to bring animals and potential adopters together? I think social media from everybody, not just from the foster parents network, but the shelter website, all of those different ways that the shelter already markets, keep doing that. I will tell you, this is now, because of COVID, a thing that everybody's talking about. How do we introduce them? Well, fosters decide. So the foster parent might say, you know what? I'm totally fine having them meet on social media. So maybe I'm going to do a Zoom with that person, or maybe I'll do FaceTime. Some people even now feel comfortable meeting in a park, especially with a dog. Some people say, well, I'll meet them at the shelter, and then if it's a go, then they can take the cat home. If it's not, I'll take them back. So I would leave it up to the foster parent regarding what they feel comfortable doing. Let's see. This is another question. What should shelters do to make volunteers feel like they are an important part of the shelter? Whoever asked that, that's the best question of the night. That is a great question. I love it so much because volunteers are so near and dear to my heart. We can't do what we do in shelters without volunteers. They are not getting a paycheck, but you know what their paycheck needs to be? If you work in a shelter, you need to learn their names, and every single time you see them, you need to say, "Hello, how are you? Thank you for coming." That's their paycheck. Just make sure they know that they're appreciated. They need to be in the loop. There's so much good news at shelters, but guess what? A lot of times volunteers don't know what's going on. So make sure you're doing emails or newsletters, whatever kind of updates you can do to say, hey, somebody got somebody that was maybe really challenging to adopt, or there was a special case. This one got adopted. Blast it out. Make sure the volunteers know. But really important, making sure that volunteers feel appreciated. And the way to do that is to learn everybody's name, make sure you say hello, and make sure you say thank you. Make sure you help them get trained appropriately because they are an asset. And the more the shelter staff works with them, the bigger asset they will be. Thank you so much for that question. So that's the end of the questions. I really appreciate you all joining this YouTube live tonight. I usually do this in person and we have several hundred people and we couldn't do it here, but this was the next best thing. So thank you so much and have a great night. Bye-bye.